The question of familiars is one which has always puzzled the student of witch trials, and almost more than any other has been the cause of the belief that hysteria and hallucination were the foundation of the witches' confessions. Yet when the accounts are carefully examined, the circumstantial detail given in the evidence shows that here, as elsewhere, a foundation of fact underlies the statements of the accused. These statements are often misunderstood and therefore misrepresented by the recorders, and still more so by the modern commentator. But by comparison of the details, a considerable amount of information can be gained. The familiars can be divided into two types. 1. Those by which the witch divined. 2. Those who attended on the witch to obey her commands. The divining familiar. The essence of this familiar is that it did not belong to the witch, but was an animal which appeared accidentally after the performance of certain magical ceremonies. Forbes puts this quite clearly when describing the contract. The devil, on his part, articles with such proselytes concerning the shape he is to appear to them, in the services they are to expect from him upon the performance of certain charms or ceremonious rites. From this statement, and from the facts revealed in the trials, it would seem that the devil appointed to the witch, on her admission, some kind of animal or animals by which she should divine, and which therefore represented himself for the time being, for he claimed the power, as God, to know and reveal the future. This explanation accounts for the fact that the witches always spoke of such animals as the devil, and believed that they could foretell the future by his means. The actual method of divination is not preserved. All that remains of the ceremony are the words and gestures which were used before the appearance of the animal, and these only in few cases. The method was probably such as obtained in other places where auguries by animals and birds were practiced, i.e. by the direction and pace of the animal, by its actions, by its voice if it emitted any sound, and so on. The method of making such observations and of translating them when made was part of the instruction given to the witch by the devil, and was usually employed to discover whether a person were bewitched, the ultimate result of an illness, and the length of life of any given person. In 1566, John Walsh of Netherbury in Dorset, who knoweth when any man is bewitched, saith upon his oath that his familiar would sometime come unto him like a grey blackish colour, and sometimes like a branded dog, and sometimes like a man. In Derbyshire in 1597, whereas Alice Goodrich said her familiar was like one William Gregory's dog of Stapenhill, there arose a rumour his dog was her familiar. Two of the Somerset witches in 1664 had familiars. To Elizabeth Style in the familiar came as a black dog, and when she have a desire to do harm, she calls the spirit by the name of Robin, to whom when he appeareth, she useth these words, O Satan, give me my purpose. She then tells him what she would have done, and that he should so appear to her was part of her contract with him. Alice Duke saith that when the devil doth anything for her, she calls for him by the name of Robin, upon which he appears, and when in the shape of a man, she can hear him speak. The domestic familiar. Forbes, the great Scotch lawyer, says that to some he, the devil, gives certain spirits or imps to correspond with, and serve them as their familiars, known to them by some odd names, to which they answer when called. These imps are said to be kept in pots or other vessels. Though the domestic familiar is thus mentioned in the law of Scotland, it never occurs in the trials. It is confined so strictly to England that Hutchinson is able to say, "I meet with little mention of imps in any country but ours, where the law makes the feeding, the suckling, and rewarding of them to be felony. It is not found north of Lancashire, and the chief records are in Essex, Suffolk, and the other eastern counties." The domestic familiar was always a small animal, was fed in a special manner on bread and milk and blood, and was kept, as Forbes points out, in a box or earthen pot on a bed of wool. Gifford records the general belief. The witches have their spirits. Some have one, some have more, as 2, 3, 4, or 5, some in one likeness and some in another, as like cats, weasels, toads, or mice, whom they nourish with milk or with a chicken, or by letting them suck now and then a drop of blood. In the earlier trials, the witches confessed to pricking the hands or face and giving the resulting drop or drops of blood to the familiar. In the later trials, this has developed into the sucking of the witch's blood by the familiar, and the supernumerary nipple, which was so marked a feature of the English witches, was popularly supposed to be caused by such sucking. It is more probable, however, that the witch who was possessed of a supernumerary nipple would regard it as something supernatural, and would use it to nourish a supernatural animal. Methods of obtaining familiars. There seem to have been 4 methods of obtaining familiars. Number 1, by gift from the devil. 2, by gift from a fellow witch. 3, by inheritance. 4, by magical ceremonies. Of these, numbers 2 and 3 appear to be confined to the domestic familiar. Consequently, they are found chiefly in the eastern counties of England. The gift of the devil was sometimes a divining familiar, sometimes a domestic familiar, commonly presented at the admission ceremony. As the divining familiar, it represented the devil himself, and the responses received to questions were believed to come from him. As the essential point of this class of familiar was that it should be a species of animals and not one special animal, the devil merely appointed to the witch what species she should observe in divining. The domestic familiar, being a small animal, could be actually given into the hands of the witch with instructions for its feeding and for the method of using it. It was sometimes, but not always, identified with the devil, and was usually called an imp, perhaps with the idea of a small or miniature devil like the marionette or sylvan villain. It acted as the devil's substitute when he himself was not present, and was endowed with some, though not all, of his power. For this reason, the witch often had more than one familiar, each to serve a single purpose. In 1645, at Ipswich, Mother Lakeland confessed that after she had signed the covenant with the devil, he furnished her with 3 imps, 2 little dogs, and a mole. In the same year, Rebecca Jones, an Essex witch, saith that, as Slice was going to St. Osyth to sell her master's butter, a man met with her, being in a ragged suit, and having such great eyes, that this examinant was much afraid of him, who came to this examinant and gave her 3 things, like to moles, having 4 feet apiece, but without tails, and of a black colour, and bid this examinant nurse the said 3 things, until he did desire them again. And the said man told this examinant that those 3 things which he gave her would avenge her on her enemies, and bid her murder some, but not too many, and he would forgive her, and then went away from this examinant. In 1646, the Huntingdonshire witch, Joan Wallace, said that Black Man told her he would send one Grizzle and Greedy Gut to her, that shall do anything for her, and after Black Man was departed from her, within 3 or 4 days, Grizzle and Greedy Gut came to her in the shapes of dogs. Another witch of the same coven, Elizabeth Weed, confessed that there did appear unto her 3 spirits, one in the likeness of a young man or boy, and the other 2 of 2 puppies, the one white and the other black. The gift from a fellow witch was always a domestic familiar, as to the devil alone belonged the power of appointing a divining familiar. Therefore this method of obtaining a familiar is found only in the eastern counties and other places where the domestic or sucking familiar is recorded. The method of obtaining a familiar by means of magical words or actions is clearly described in 2 modern examples. Sometime in the beginning of the last century, 2 old dames attended the morning service at Llandoughy Brefi Church and partook of the Holy Communion, but instead of eating the sacred bread like other communicants, they kept it in their mouths and went out. Then they walked round the church outside 9 times, and at the 9th time the evil one came out from the church wall in the form of a frog, to whom they gave the bread from their mouths, and by doing this wicked thing they were supposed to be selling themselves to Satan and become witches. There was an old man in North Pembrokeshire who used to say that he obtained the power of bewitching in the following manner. The bread of his first communion he pocketed. He made pretence at eating it first of all, and then put it in his pocket. When he went out from the service, there was a dog meeting him by the gate, to which he gave the bread, thus selling his soul to the devil. Ever after he possessed the power to bewitch. On the analogy of these 2 examples, I suggest that in the accounts of familiars offering themselves to the witch, there was, previous to such appearance, some formula of words or some magical action which are not recorded. The animal which first appeared after such words or actions would be considered as the devil, as in the 2 cases quoted above. Such an explanation accounts for the statements of some of the witches that on the appearance of the animal they at once renounced the Christian religion and vowed obedience to the new God. It is noticeable that in many cases the accused acknowledged that, before the appearance of the animal, they had been banning and cursing, in other words, calling on the devil. The appearance of the animal after such summons produced neither surprise nor alarm, and in fact seems to have been regarded as the effect of their words. Transformations into animals. The belief that human beings can change themselves or be changed into animals carries with it the corollary that wounds received by a person when in the semblance of an animal will remain on the body after the return to human shape. This belief seems to be connected with the worship of animal gods or sacred animals, the worshipper being changed into an animal by being invested with the skin of the creature, by the utterance of magical words, by the making of magical gestures, the wearing of a magical object, or the performance of magical ceremonies. The witches of the 16th and 17th centuries appear to have carried on the tradition of the pre-Christian cults, and the stories of their transformations, when viewed in the light of the ancient examples, are capable of the same explanation. Much confusion, however, has been caused by the religious and so-called scientific explanations of the contemporary commentators, as well as by the unfortunate belief of modern writers in the capacity of women for hysteria. At both periods, pseudoscience has prevented the unbiased examination of the material. There are no records extant of the animals held sacred by the early inhabitants of Great Britain, but it is remarkable that the range of the witches' transformations was very limited. Cats and hares were the usual animals, occasionally but rarely dogs, mice, crows, rooks and bees. In France, where the solemn sacrifice of a goat at the Sabbath points to the animal being sacred, it is not surprising to find both men and women witches appearing as goats and sheep. Unless there were some definite meaning underlying the change of shape, there would be no reason to prevent the witches from transforming themselves into animals of any species, It would seem, then, that the witches, like the adorers of animal gods in earlier times, attempted to become one with their god or sacred animal by taking on his form, the change being induced by the same means and being as real to the witch as to Sigmund the Volsung or the worshipper of Lycian Zeus. In the earlier cults, the worshipper, on becoming an animal, changed his outward shape to the eye of faith alone, though his actions and probably his voice proclaimed the transformation. The nearest approach to an outward change was by covering the body with the skin of the animal, or by wearing a part of the skin or a mask. The witches themselves admitted that they were masked and veiled, and the evidence of other witnesses goes to prove the same. The witches were often disguised at the dance, a fact strongly suggesting that the masking was entirely ritual. As the witch trials in Great Britain seldom mention, much less describe, the dance, it follows that the greater number of the cases of masks are found in France, though a few occur in Scotland, still fewer in England.